I'm Ivona. I'm the founder of Sustainao. We are a sustainability consulting firm based in Singapore. I've worked in the sustainability field for a decade now. I was a sustainability auditor, so I was verifying sustainability information published in sustainability reports at KPMG back in France. And then moving to Singapore, I was like, okay, let's be crazy and create my own journey. So I'd like today to share a few insights more on the S part. So I know today it was everything about climate justice. So we do touch a bit on the social part, but we thought maybe it would be important to give you an overview of what the social aspect of sustainability represents for businesses and also in the Singapore context. So some of the things I might share, you might be already quite familiar with if you already worked in sustainability. Who was working on sustainability? Okay, good. So good experience audience. Who have already worked in a sustainability strategy? Okay. How many of you worked on a sustainability report? Okay, good. So I'll try to adapt a bit because my sharing is a bit more overview, but we can adapt and don't forget to ask questions at the end. So the first idea is a sustainable future is not just about climate action, it's about empowering people and uplifting societies. So as most of you are already experts on sustainability, you might already know, of course, the 3 pillars of sustainable development, which is economy, social, and environment. And you might be familiar with those 3 circles and the intersection of them. That's what we call sustainability. But I prefer this version because it shows the actual dependency that we have on the environment, right? So we focus on the economy as sustainable development. We want growth in the economy and want it to be just for society. But there is no economy without people, and there is no people without the environment. We all rely on the resources we have, on the air we breathe, on the water we drink, on the soil and the ocean we use for food, for raw materials, and so on. So in the end, everything is back to environment that we depend on, and also sustainable development. It's about us in the end. That's what we're trying to save, right? We're not trying to save the planet, actually. We're trying to save us. But when we try to translate that into the corporate setting, into businesses, how do we make it, how do we measure that, right? So that's what we are trying to do through sustainability. But still, sustainability for many companies, again, the focus, as we discussed during the previous panelist session, is a bit more on decarbonization now. It's important for us to remember the social aspect too. So if you already worked on a strategy or a report, you know that the 3 pillars would be environment, social, and governance. And when we work with companies as a consultant, we do what you might know is a materiality assessment, the process to identify the most relevant topics for the company itself and for the stakeholders. And that's the foundation to build a strategy. And today we're going to focus more on the middle pillar, the social one. And in Singapore, it's some interesting statistics. This is for listed companies who had to publish sustainability reports every year for a few years now. And we see the evolution of what are the top 10 material topics from 2021 compared to 2023. And out of the 10 topics, actually 4 of them are social. I mean, I consider stakeholder engagement, even if they put it as governance, I consider it as a social topic. And in 2021, only 4% of listed companies would report or consider material or part of their strategy, where now it's 77%, right? We can put the same for diversity, equity, and opportunities, or D&I, 43% compared to 84% now. So we definitely see, for those who work in sustainability more comprehensively, we definitely see also an uplift or growth, interest or strategy or actions on the social part. And also labor relations, labor practices and relations, usually human rights is the most difficult to enter in the discussion with, in a board meeting. Now, if you look more at smaller companies and those who debut, let's say, who want to formalize their sustainability strategy and they know where to start, when they touch on the S, it can be quite scary in the sense of like, where do I start with? There are like so many different topics, you know, which one should I measure, how, and so on. With carbon, I was discussing this with Anne another day, saying like with decarbonization, we have one unit, that's the ton of CO2, but on social, what do you count? So this is what we're trying to see now. For me, the first step is to understand what are your key stakeholders, and to think of what are the key social impacts for each group of stakeholders. So the first one that any company should look at is, of course, your own employees. Right? So for own employees, you can think of your labor and human rights practices, health and safety, talent management, diversity, equity, and inclusivity, and so on and so on. Then we have suppliers. Earlier we discussed about the supplier code of conduct, and that's kind of like the first things that you do on your checklist. But what's behind the supplier code of conduct or a sustainable procurement approach? We still get back to labor and human rights. We still go back to health and safety, diversity, and so on. So it's, for suppliers, a bit more like what you do for your own employees. How do you make sure that your suppliers also abide by the same principles as you have? How do you ensure they have the same standards as you? Right? But also you have to think of customers, consumers, of most of the time companies who at least start with the health and safety of the products and services, and usually the compliance and quality team would work on that. Now also you can think of like the data and customer privacy, you can also consider as a social issue. And then the broader type of stakeholder would be communities, community engagement, corporate social responsibility. And of course, even in communities, you can think of human rights, climate justice, and so on. But by putting that list by type of stakeholder, you can try to map your different social impacts, social topics, and try to prioritize and see where you have the highest level of influence, highest level of impact, and where you can start working in all these layers. And to do that, we can take the example first for employees. And this is something I do on any sustainability topic when I start with a company just at the beginning and they want to understand what's their sustainability performance, let's say, or like their starting line. We do a gap analysis for each material topic. So let's say you define 3 material topics on environment, 3 in social, 3 in governance. And for each one of them, we look at these 3 criteria: policies, actions, and metrics. It sounds simple, but it works. It's effective because it maps everything that matters. So policies, you think of not just the formalized policies, which are important, but the goal behind is what's your vision? What's your commitment? Do you have any targets? What's your guidelines on that topic? The second one is the actions, what you actually do on your day-to-day business, what do you implement, what measure. And then metrics is how do you measure your performance, right? So that gives you an overview. So for HR, for example, the example of policies you could look at is employee handbook, code of conduct, non-discrimination policy, D&I policy or equal opportunities policies, human rights, health and safety manual, and so on. So the first thing you might notice is that maybe half of this, most companies might already have, right? And that's kind of like the good news, is that compared to things that are more technical for some, such as climate change, where for some that really just start, everything it seems new and more technical. On the social aspect, it's quite rare to start from scratch. There's always something already there. So when you include it in your sustainability strategies, like how do you make it better? How do you go above just the compliance part or just like the minimum thing that's expected from you to do? So even if you look at your code of conduct or employee handbook, are you really up to the best practices you could implement? Also, like current certifications you can have on health and safety, ISO 45001 or Be Safe, that could also help on this part. Then actions, you can think everything that empowers your employees, trainings, employee engagement. You can also conduct human rights risk assessments. Do you do flexible working? Do you have any collective bargaining agreements? So you can have a long list of criteria based on what's relevant for you to see if your actions are effective. And finally, the metrics. This one, you have a lot of standards, frameworks that can help you to select the ones more meaningful. The goal of metrics is just to give you an idea of whether you're doing good or not. And again, what you don't measure, you cannot see if there's any performance on it or not. And across these metrics, some are in your departments you might already have. Like if you have a health and safety department, obviously they will have something like an accident frequency rate. Your HR might know about, what's your average training hours per employee, hires and turnover, and so on. But just looking at the data and assessing every year what's the data point doesn't really matter. What matters is how you analyze that data, right? Whenever I discuss with companies, and they will say, like, I ask, do you have any remuneration policies? Yes, no. Either might have a salary grid or not. It's like, okay, do you pay fairly everyone? Who would say no? Obviously, everyone's going to say they pay fairly their employees. So like, okay, that's great, amazing. Can you prove it? Have you ever conducted a benchmarking, maybe to assess if all your employees are paid above living wage? What? Living wage? What's that? In the different countries where you operate, right? It's a starting point, right? Have you done a benchmark to see if you pay up to market, or the living wage is more like what you say you have to do? Then we go further. We go into gender diversity, right? Do our men and women pay equitably? It's like, yes, of course, we give everyone the same chances. Can you prove it? And again, if you have not conducted a gender pay gap assessment, you cannot know if you do it well or not. Or you might have that as a policy, but if you don't measure the implementation of your policy, you cannot really know if it's actually effective. So now there are guidelines and methodologies on how to calculate and how to assess if indeed workers from are paid fairly or equally. And the results might be exactly what you expected, that it's the case. In that case, fantastic. You can share that with your employees, with everyone, and be proud of it. And if it's not the case, need to assess the gap and what could do better. Now, earlier there was a question about certifications for SMEs, and they're like so many and difficult. It's the same for all the other standards in terms of like reporting or strategy. So I added here just a tiny bit of few, I would say, because when I add the 50 ones that I think are important, everyone says like, Ivona, you're crazy. We'll never be able to do all of that. But for sure, multinationals, they kind of like have to align with a lot of them. But here I put some examples of those who I do find important for any company. So, of course, we have the Sustainable Development Goals that does cover both environmental, social, governance, economic topics. So usually companies align their sustainability strategy with the SDGs by aligning with maybe 6, 7 that are the most relevant for them. But the foundation is actually the 10th principle of the United Nations Global Compact, which also comes from UN, that also covers environment, corruption, labor, human rights aspects. So that's one, right? So for an SME, doesn't know where to start. Now you can sign the 10 principles of Global Compact. That's a good starting. Then you can also look at the SDGs. That's going to help you on prioritization and on the strategy. Now reporting. So GRI, don't use GRI for strategy. GRI is for reporting. Right? It's to see which metrics are most relevant, to help you do a materiality assessment, and to do a sustainability report. Okay? Now it's the IFRS is coming with the 2 standards, one on sustainability, the other one on climate. So that's going to be more like for the future, need to be aware of. But what I personally prefer are actually the rating and rankings. And because when we work with companies, we do kind of like we have this loop of plan, do, check, act, kind of like if for those who worked in ISO. But the idea is like you start with strategy, you deploy it, you report the performance, but then you don't stop at a sustainability report. It's useless. It's an end loop. You actually use that information to do ESG ratings, assessments, awards, that actually is going to give you an idea of what's your performance. Because if you just me, look at what I did, and no one assesses how actually you score compared to another company in your industry, that's where the risk of greenwashing comes. Right? So, of course, these ratings, rankings, all that are not perfect. I'm not entering in that debate, but it's still a safeguard for companies who are serious about sustainability to assess, to analyze their performance. And you could use that even without really going for the certification. That's the case for B Corp, for example. They're a bit more focused on the social aspect. So you could still use the B Lab assessment to see where you are. It's going to ask you all those questions like policies, actions, metrics. And you can see where you are. What's your baseline? But you can also go for the actual certification if it makes sense for your business. And in some cases like EcoVadis, that's also a very comprehensive assessment. That's more a B2B request. If one of your customers asks you to do EcoVadis, go for it. That's like when customers ask you to go for ESG assessments, even if it's this one or another one, that means there is a demand. That means that those customers included you in their supply chain program, in their sustainable procurement assessment program, and they are interested in you and seeing how you develop your services and products in a sustainable way. Just checking the timing. Okay, still good. I like to close with this overview. It's kind of like what I've mentioned a bit earlier, but I put it more in a linear way. And before even you think about strategy, it's actually governance is the first step. So when I work with companies, the first thing I ask them, what's your sustainability team? And they will say, I have no one. It's like, of course you have. We're going to find people. Sustainability is not one person's job. Forget about it. Don't even enter in that area if you think you're going to hire one person, one chief of sustainability, who's going to do all the job and everything. That's working in silo. It doesn't work. That person, even if you hire, I do encourage you to hire a head of sustainability or a chief sustainability officer, however you name it. That's perfect, that's great. But that person's role is to actually, it's more like project management, right? Is to put together all the relevant departments, create a sustainability committee, add knowledge, understand the different frameworks, assessments you can do, and then dig with every department on how they rethink, I'm citing Sam earlier, how they rethink the way they do, the different actions they do in the company. So governance, either from the social perspective or sustainability as a whole, is putting together the different departments in the company to cut up the silos and to work together on the different social aspects. So the first thing you can think, of course, HR should be part of it, but also maybe IT, maybe legal, maybe compliance, based on the relevant topics you have. With stakeholder engagement with these people, and people can be outside of the company too, you can conduct a quick materiality assessment to list the main ESG topics, in that case, social topics here, that are the most relevant for your industry, for your company, and for your stakeholders. Then you can do that gap analysis I showed you, simple, just policies, action, metrics, to see what's your foundation. And based on that, if you compare yourself with the best practices, or at least good practices, or where you would like to be if you really want to improve your performance, then you define a strategy with, of course, goals and targets and so on. Now, you don't jump directly from strategy to performance or reporting, right? That's just, you have the slides of the strategy, you send it, then see you next year to do the report. It's not, the actual work just starts there. When you arrive at the strategy, is to just get you the vision of what you have to do. The deployment, the actual implementation, that's what requires most of your time of working with the different departments, working with our suppliers, working with the communities, doing partnerships, engaging with NGOs, and so on, to drive meaningful impact. And then the performance reporting when it's needed, if it's needed, publicly, if not, internally, it's also very fine. And then if it's good for you, you can also go for awards and certification. That's the summary of what I had to share today. Thank you very much.